Welcome back to Telltale Books. This video, I'm going to start another new series of reading complete works by an author. The author is Brian W. Aldiss, and so I'll be talking about his first published story here, but first I want to talk a little bit about Aldiss. Not that I'm an expert or anything, not a professor, I haven't read any biographies of him. There's a lot I don't know about Brian Aldiss. What I can tell you is that he's a British author, or he was a British author. He lived from 1925 until 2017. He was born in East Durham, Norfolk, England. And he started publishing, I should say, in 1954 with the short story I'll be dealing with today, A Book in Time. And he quickly became very well known, quickly became a master of science fiction, along with a whole generation of authors that really pulled the genre up from its pulp roots. He was contemporary with Philip K. Dick, Harlan Ellison, John Brunner, Robert Silverberg, Michael Moorcock, J.G. Ballard, most of whom I'm going to be talking about in other author series through the coming years. So he was part of a generation that really revised science fiction and became associated with the new wave. Now, some people will say that the authors from the 50s were not really new wave authors, that it's the authors that got started publishing in the late 1960s. Those are the new wave authors. But typically, when you talk about new wave books, you're talking about the more literate works of people like J.G. Ballard, Brian Aldiss, John Brunner, books like The Sheep Look Up, books that were more literary, better written, and were more relevant to the world of their day, as well as being more experimental in the way that they wrote. So I don't care how you want to classify these authors. They are the authors that really, really made science fiction viable as literature rather than just pulp adventure stories. So Brian Aldiss in particular, he became quickly noted and remained very, very well known for certain works that he did that made a bigger impact than other works, starting with short stories in the 1950s like Poor Little Warrior and Who Can Replace a Man, continuing with his first novels like Nonstop and Cryptozoic, The Long Afternoon of Earth, continuing onward into the late 60s with stories like Brothers of the Head. And that one, he had certain works that were made into movies. Brothers of the Head was made into a movie, although very difficult to find a copy of it. Frankenstein Unbound was made into a very quirky but kind of cool movie by Roger Corman. And, of course, his short story Super Toys Last All Summer Long was the basis for the movie AI by Stanley Kubrick and Steven Spielberg, which is one of my favorite movies. Now, my personal experience with Aldiss's writing started when I first started reading. I discovered H.G. Wells. Reading H.G. Wells made me go out and discover other things. I discovered Isaac Asimov when I picked up his novelization of Fantastic Voyage, which was a movie I liked. And I picked up another book that I thought was going to be all Isaac Asimov works. It turned out to be an anthology that Asimov edited, had one of his stories in, but it had a whole bunch of other writers. And so I was introduced to the likes of Lester Del Rey and Larry Niven And then I went back to the local bookstore looking for more, and I found this right next to Isaac Asimov because it's Mike Ashley, and they had things alphabetized. It's again an anthology. I fell in love with this cool metallic cover. So I bought it and read it right away, and this introduced me to a lot more authors like Henry Kuttner and Harry Harrison, Clifford Simak, Murray Leinster. Philip Dick has a story in here, Imposter. And also Who Can Replace a Man by Brian Aldiss. That was the first story I read by Aldiss. And after reading that, I right away wanted to read more by Aldiss, so I went back to the bookstore. At that time, all that was on the shelves at that bookstore were some anthologies that Aldiss had done, Space Odysseys and the 2-volume Galactic Empires. I bought those, I loved them, introduced me to a lot more authors, but not really more Aldiss. It wasn't until Avon published a series of Aldiss books a little later on that I read these 2 books, Cryptozoic and Starship, which absolutely blew me away. Phenomenal science fiction books, like nothing else I had read yet at that time, and made me fall in love with Aldiss's writing. And the first new book of his to be released after that was The Malaysia Tapestry, which I bought and read. It was very thick, which bothered me, and it wasn't science fiction, which also bothered me. I was nothing but science fiction at that time. It had to be science fiction. Well, Malaysia Tapestry was historical fantasy, but it was really good historical fantasy. I did enjoy it. I did read the whole thing, and I did really enjoy that book, but it wasn't science fiction, so I need to reread it now because I'm not quite so adamant about just science fiction anymore. I bet it'll be one of my all-time favorite novels if I read it again. So I've loved Aldiss's writings for as long as I've been reading. There's a lot of it I haven't read yet, and I want to change that. I want to read everything of his fiction, at least. He did write some nonfiction books, which there was at least one that was a history of science fiction that made a huge impact on people's thinking about science fiction. Aldis was one of the first to consider Frankenstein a science fiction novel, and Aldis considered Frankenstein to be the very first science fiction novel. But I want to read all of his fiction, and so I'm getting started with, or I have gotten started with, A Book in Time, which was published in the February 1954 issue of The Bookseller, not a science fiction magazine. And as you can guess, it must be a magazine aimed entirely at booksellers. And so the story has to do with books, but the story is science fiction. The basic synopsis of the story is a man goes into a bookstore, sees another man taking a couple of books and hiding them inside his coat, and that second man immediately exits the shop. So the first man pursues him, chases him down the street. The second man gets into a car, but it's not a car. The first man catches up to it and finds out there's no wheels on it, but he still jumps onto the running board and holds onto the car, and suddenly finds himself in a different landscape. It's a field. And the second man gets out of the car and informs the first man that he is now in the year 2054. He traveled 100 years into the future. I'm going to stop there because after that, the story has some twists and stuff that I don't want to spoil for you because it's worth reading. I don't think it's a great story. I don't think it's a top tale, but it's a very good story. It's a fun story. It's not as serious as something like Starship or Cryptozoic. It's a little lighter, not really humorous, but I found myself smiling at the end of the story after reading it. It was fun. It was enjoyable. And I recommend it on that alone. It's not great, but it is totally enjoyable. Little difficult to track it down because it's not like the science fiction magazines where I can tell you can just go to archive.org and there's PDFs waiting for you. The only place I could find it is in this, and this is not in print anymore. You got to buy it used. A little pricey these days, but it is the complete short stories, the 1950s of the Brian Aldiss collection from the Friday Project. They only did the 1950s and the 1960s and they stopped. Don't know why they didn't do complete short stories for the 70s, 80s, 90s, so forth, but they didn't. But this is where I'm starting. This is all of his 1950s short stories. This will take me up to Starship. And A Book in Time is in here. It's the first story in here. A Book in Time is very short. It's like 5 pages in this. And so I read it in 15 minutes. It was very, very short story, but very enjoyable. It was exactly what I was looking for at that moment. I wanted something short. I wanted something easy. And it gave me everything that I was looking for. So that's Aldiss's first story. I will be continuing. The next story will be Criminal Record, which was published in Science Fantasy in 1954. Science Fantasy was one of the 2 top British science fiction magazines at the time, Science Fantasy and New Worlds. And I think they were published by the same publisher, if I'm not mistaken. So, come on back, keep watching, and some of them might end up in our Patreon. We are going to be putting some videos as well as a lot of other content into our new Patreon account. You have to subscribe to do it, but hey, it's going to support our mission towards publishing our first book. We want to publish books, and any money we make through our Patreon account or through our Etsy store is going into an account towards publishing our first book. We got a long way to go, a lot of money to collect, because neither of us has money lying around to do this. So we need your help. I feel like I'm on PBS right now. We need your help. With your support, we can continue to bring you such great content. But seriously, this is what the Patreon is all about, is getting us toward that goal of producing a book which everybody but our Patreon subscribers will probably have first dibs, but ultimately everybody will have access to purchasing this book from us if we can get it off the ground. And we want to make it the best book you have ever seen, of that particular title anyway. We haven't even decided what title that's going to be. We've got it kind of narrowed down, but we don't have it down to just what the first one will be. But support us on Patreon, please. And if you can't support us on Patreon, keep coming back and watching these YouTube videos. Follow our Facebook and Instagram accounts, and pass this on to your friends. Maybe your friends will want to help us, and maybe your friends will be interested. Maybe your friends will just like watching our videos. But talk us up and help us get there. We will greatly appreciate it, and we will somehow make it worth your while. So for now, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you'll come back and see me in the next Brian Aldiss video or any of the other authors we're going to continue to put on YouTube.